So why don't we begin by reading not only St. Matthew, the Transfiguration in St. Matthew's Gospel, but the Transfiguration also appears in St. Mark's and St. Luke's Gospel, and it's also mentioned in the second letter of St. Peter. So let's look at all four of those things. Let's start with St. Matthew at chapter 17, verse 1. So, hi, Barbara.
Hi, Barbara. Everybody.
So we're making very rapid progress here. Already in chapter 17. We're going to be done with Matthew's Gospel in no time at all. Possibly another 2 years.
Yeah, it's only been 3 years already. No, almost.
Almost, yeah. So chapter 17, verse 1. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain apart. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with them. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is well that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 booths here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And when they lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? He replied, Elijah does come, and he is to restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist.
I'll be right back.
So let's look at Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Ron. Good evening.
Good
Hey,
evening.
Ron. Hi, Joe.
Good evening, ma'am.
What did you say? What chapter, Mark?
Mark chapter 9, verse 2.
Mark is very small. It's only like 14 chapters? 16?
Yeah, it's the shortest of the Gospels. But strangely, in a lot of areas, it has much more detail than Matthew.
Really? Oh.
So chapter 9, Matthew is not a big fan of detail. Only we are. But chapter 9, verse 2, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his garments became glistening, intensely white, as no fuller on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses. So notice he has Elijah first and then Moses. Matthew has Moses first and then Elijah. And they were talking to Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. In Matthew's version, Peter volunteers to make the booths himself, not with the other two disciples.
What do you call them?
What to say, for they were exceedingly afraid. Matthew doesn't say that. And a cloud overshadowed them. Matthew describes it as a bright cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. A shortened formulation. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man should have risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And he said to them, Elijah does come to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. So that doesn't clearly tie Elijah with John the Baptist. Right? So a short passage, but significant differences. Luke's version is also chapter 9, starting in verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Both Matthew and Mark says it is after 8 days. 6
Excuse
days.
me.
Rather.
Excuse me, Ron.
Uh-huh.
Is it Luke 28, did you say?
Luke chapter 9.
Oh, 9.
Yeah,
Okay,
9 verse
sorry.
28.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mhm. So
Okay.
no, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men talked with him, Moses and Elijah. Here again, Luke has Moses and Elijah rather than Elijah and Moses, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Matthew doesn't talk about the exodus. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep but kept awake, and they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. As he said this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silence and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. Luke doesn't have any of the detail about John the Baptist or Elijah coming first. Then finally, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18.
Which one is it? Peter?
2 Peter.
Where is that one?
Peter comes right after James's letter.
Right after what?
James's letter.
James.
It's Paul, Hebrews, James, then Peter. The two letters of Peter, then the letters of John, and then the book of Revelation. Actually, that's not quite right. There's also the letter of Jude,
So what chapter?
2 Peter
chapter 1,
1, verse
verse 16. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." We heard this voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain. And we have the prophetic word made more sure. You will do well to pay attention to this, as to a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. So Peter clearly ties the transfiguration and the vision to the second coming. So how does the transfiguration relate to the previous chapter and to the earlier portions of St. Matthew's Gospel? Does anyone have any ideas?
Well, it's reminiscent of the baptism, actually, towards the beginning.
Right. The words are the same, except for listen to him.
Yes.
So we have,
Sort of like bookends to his public life.
yeah. Anything else? So it goes back to the baptism in terms of the earlier portions before chapter 16. It also goes back into chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Let's take a look at them. It's Matthew's fulfillment quotation from Isaiah.
Sorry, what chapter was that?
Chapter 4, verse 15.
Thank you.
Remember here, this doesn't exactly correspond to either. Matthew has used both the versions of Isaiah from the Masoretic text and from the Septuagint, and has also massaged them to add, to modify them to suit his purposes. But reads, "The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, toward the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned." So here we have the light. And in some sense, it's a greater fulfillment of the prophecy in chapter 4, which roughly marks the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And so it's a greater fulfillment. So what about chapter 16? How does the transfiguration relate to chapter 16?
I mean, they are just revealed that he was the Son of God, the Messiah, by
Right.
Peter.
Uh-huh.
And then now he kind of,
But also remember, so he was the Son of the God, the Son of the living God, the Messiah, who must suffer and die. So the disciples have a hard time with that. How can the Messiah suffer and die? How can the Son of God suffer and die? The Son of God is supposed to be glorious. He's not supposed to be dead. right? He's not supposed to be defeated. And so part
Perhaps,
of the,
I was gonna say, perhaps if Peter kept him there in his tent, then he wouldn't die.
that's very good. Yeah, exactly. You know, we'll discuss that. Uh, that's not a very common insight, but it is the insight from Pope Saint Leo the Great.
Oh my.
So
Mary, look at you.
so you're in very good
Wow.
company. So part of the significance of the Transfiguration is that it shows the disciples. So the disciples really are the witnesses of the Transfiguration, right? The three disciples, Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee. So the vision is for them. It's not, for Jesus is a participant along with Moses and Elijah. And it shows them that although Jesus will suffer and die, that his execution does not mean he's accursed. And it does not mean that he's rejected by God, as the voice of God affirms. So in chapter 16, chapter 16 had ended with Jesus saying in verse 28, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And Peter in his letter had stressed the Transfiguration as a prophetic vision about Jesus coming in his kingdom. So the Transfiguration looks forward to the second coming. It's really a foretaste and a foreshadowing of the second coming. It illustrates the glory of the Parousia, the second coming. And then related to that, while Jesus said that some of those standing here will witness the Son of Man in the glory of his kingdom, the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, have already had a foretaste of it in the Transfiguration. So we have those five themes: continuing confession of Jesus as the Messiah, Son of God, the foretaste of end times prophecy, Jesus' vindication, the foretaste of some of those standing here, and then also the baptism and the white heaven dawn. So questions about that? So this is really part of ongoing. Jesus had indicated to Peter that he didn't understand that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God by human means, but through divine revelation. And so this vision confirms that, confirms the validity of the divine revelation, the supernatural revelation that Peter had had. So what does transfiguration mean?
Well, it said that his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. So he just changed in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Jerome says it is not that the substance is removed, but the glory is changed. So Jesus did not lose his original form and appearance. And he says the Lord was transformed into that glory with which he is going to come later in his kingdom. Matthew also uses the third person passive that Jesus was transfigured. So that's a divine passive, that he was transfigured by the Father. He was transfigured by God, and his glory revealed, the glory that he will have after the resurrection, the glory that he'll have at the second coming.
Ron,
Uh-huh.
what is the difference between transfiguration and the one that happens with the, yes, thank you, that word. That one that happens with the Eucharist. What is the difference in definition on that?
The difference, transfiguration refers to the transformation of an inner state. So instead of simply Jesus, you have a divine, his divinity appears and he becomes
He froze.
white, he glows because he's divine. So you see Jesus' inner divinity. So it's the same Jesus, but it's inner divinity. Transubstantiation involves a change. So it's still Jesus, but he's now clearly divine. So in some sense, nothing has really changed, but the inner essence is more clearly exposed. Transubstantiation involves a change of the essence without a change of what Aquinas calls its accidents, its properties. So in transubstantiation, the accidents are bread and wine. Those accidents remain, but the substance of what that bread and wine is change. The bread is no longer bread. The bread is now the body of Christ, but it merely appears to be bread. It retains the accidents of bread, but not its substance.
How do you spell that? Accidents?
Accidents,
Okay.
or use properties instead. Aristotelian philosophy distinguishes between essence and accident. So, for example, to take me, if you cut off my arms and cut off my legs, right, I'm still me. Right? Simply the accidents of my arms and legs have disappeared, but the essence is still the same as long as I'm alive. If I'm not alive, then whatever remains is an accident because the essence has departed. It's dead, right? So there's essence, the basic nature of a thing, and there are the accidents, which are properties that attach to it. So in the case of the wine, we have wine that is transformed into the blood of Christ, but it retains the accidents of wine. It still appears to be wine, although it actually isn't wine. It's the blood of Christ. So the essence has changed, the accidents remain.
Okay.
So that's the difference between transfiguration and transubstantiation.
Okay. Just want to let you know that I'm seeing here on my screen that our time is gonna run out in 6 minutes.
Yeah, I saw that as well.
Oh,
Okay.
So when it does, we can connect with the second meeting, and that should run for 45 minutes as well. And we have 6 minutes and 10 seconds left. Okay, are there any other questions at this point? Is that clear, the difference between transfiguration and transubstantiation?
That was a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very good question. So what kind of imagery is St. Matthew drawing on here? The transfiguration is a typological event. What is it a type of?
What he's going to look like when he comes back in the second coming.
It's a type of the second coming. It points forward to it. But what does it point back to? Any ideas?
Well, it reminds me of Elijah when he left on the clouds and in the chariot.
Uh-huh. Although I think that's probably, we'll discuss Elijah in a little bit. But Elijah is probably not the primary, the type that Matthew is trying to represent. How about Moses?
When he encountered God on the mountain?
On Sinai, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So so Jesus led them up a high mountain. Mountains are always significant because the mountain is a place of revelation, right? And we're going to see that typology. The mountain is a place of revelation. In this case, the mountain is a representation of Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. They're the same mountain. Mount Sinai, where Moses encountered God, Mount Horeb, where Elijah encountered the still, quiet voice. So mountains are always places of revelation. And then Jesus comes down from the mountain where he heals the boy with epilepsy, which we're going to see is, in some sense, a reenactment of the golden calf. Not as serious or, as fatal, for lack of a better word, not as deadly, but nevertheless something of a typological reenactment. So the transfiguration occurs on a mountaintop, which is where Moses encountered God on Mount Sinai on a mountaintop. Chapter 19 and chapter 24 of Exodus. Matthew also says that it's 6 days later, and Matthew is not very Matthew is not very attentive as a rule to the passage of time. So if Matthew is going to mention that it's 6 days later, there's evidently a purpose in it. This is actually the only instance in his gospel in which Matthew pays attention to elapsed time. So in Exodus chapter 24, verse 16, the glory cloud, the Shekinah, appeared for 6 days. The glory cloud of God appeared for 6 days. And then God calls to Moses to approach. Also in approaching and going up Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 24, verse 2, Moses was accompanied by 3 people. He was accompanied by Aaron, his brother, who became the high priest, by Nadab, and by Abihu. So there were 3 people, and there are 3 people accompanying Jesus here. Jesus, the most striking thing about Jesus is his shining face, which reveals his inner glory. And let's take a look at Exodus chapter 34, verse 29.